Detention is a 2D horror game released in early 2017 centering on teens experiencing deadly paranormal happenings in Taiwan during the 1960s, a period smack bang in the middle of an oppressive and strict nationwide martial law imposed on the country by its governing party. It's a somber title with a harsh atmosphere that focuses on exploration, puzzle solving, and story rather than combat. In the following video, I won't be spoiling any major plot points, but I will be discussing gameplay scenarios as well as elements of the setting and environment of the game in some detail. We will be discussing the nature of this game's world, so fair warning in case you want to go in completely blind and discover every tiny facet of the title for yourself. Detention offered up some good chills and gave me some great insight into historical events I was pretty oblivious to beforehand. Through an intriguing premise, the game kept me wanting to see where all the cryptic symbolism and discarded records slowly describing the enigmatic backstory of our leads and creepy school the player is trapped in was going. I'd go as far as to say that the premise, wonderfully stylized and evocative environmental design, and novelty of the historical setting was enough to make me conclude that I enjoyed and indeed liked Detention, despite it lacking much in the way of mechanical complexity, which I usually value a lot in a horror title. Yes, this will be one of those spook-em-ups where you'll be running away and hiding from the monsters rather than carefully managing resources to dispose of them. You wake up in the evening in your deserted school, everyone is gone and there's no escape. Things are looking grim, and even before the environment starts getting all corrupted and twisted, there's no denying how effective the school at night setting is for horror. It's a place you're just not supposed to be at that time of day. Already it's something familiar, warped in a way one isn't used to. On a very superficial level, the game evokes the likes of, say, Corpse Party, another game about being caught in a hell limbo masquerading as a school. But while Corpse Party has its sights more set on the shock value it can wring out of dismembering a cutesy cast of high school girls and boys, Detention is looking to amalgamate its oppressive frights with the equally oppressive story of what it's like to grow up in 1960s Taiwan, where freedom of expression and thought is cracked down on by the powers that be. But rather than being a perfect synergy of reality and metaphor, in practice it comes across more as a game trying really hard to justify telling a story about a young girl living in a harsh and unfair society by framing it within the compelling tropes and context of a survival horror video game. It feels like the story comes first and the horror game comes second. Not much justification is given within that story as to why we're being told the events via a spooky Silent Hill-esque set of levels with puzzles and discarded notes. In a series like Silent Hill, the games use the supernatural to explore via metaphor the backstory and trauma of various cast members. But why the paranormal events are happening is given its own extensive explanation in the universe of the franchise and forms part of that story itself. The horror in Detention is merely a framing device, and while it does an excellent job with that framing device, for example, the meaning of a lot of early cryptic hints in the form of spooks alluding to the game's twists come into focus as you play, it never gets around to really justifying using horror game tropes to tell its tale. This isn't the kind of game you go playing if you're looking to find out why this haunted world you're exploring exists in any real detail. More so, it's something you jump into to experience an interesting tragic story through an engaging and enveloping narrative style. That style being the horror game. But its use can't quite stop Detention from feeling like the important events, the meat of the story, is somewhere else, while you piece it together inside a few corridors of light puzzle solving. Silent Hill 2 is probably the most famous example of the horror game character study, and it got away with not really being about the monsters because part of the twist of that game is that it's subverting Silent Hill 1 to an extent. A title which was in great part about the spiritual force in the town and the creatures it created. The fact that Silent Hill 2 isn't actually about stopping some large evil force is part of the surprise of that game. But Detention just kinda takes it for granted that you don't care about that. In its eyes, horror doesn't need to explain itself and be about the horror. Heck, it doesn't really think anything of real consequence needs to happen in the events you're playing for the most part. In Silent Hill 2, even if the story is focused on examining the psyche of each character, the events of the game will have an effect on the future of the cast. The protagonist of that game's actions in the town do mean something. While outside of a few ethereal sequences near the end, Detention is purely here using the horror game as just a tool to explain some characters and a historical setting to you. And I don't know how I entirely feel about that. Detention isn't wrong in that when it comes to horror, it is the exploration of human drama through unreal circumstances that ends up being the most interesting part, even if the game gives the supernatural elements plenty of context, or if that context itself is still interesting. For an extreme example, what happens in Detention's story is obviously more compelling than, say, the plot of the first Resident Evil, a title that tells you where the monsters were made and why and all that junk. Here we have a superb tragic story which, while fairly simple in hindsight, once everything wraps up manages to be way more evocative thanks to being told as a horror game. Communicating how the characters feel about the world around them through esoteric imagery you can get away with in cryptic, spooky video game environments, or even through the items used to solve the different puzzles. Puzzles, and therefore in turn the gameplay, being pretty straightforward. Get X item, take X item to place, use X item on thing until you reach the item that lets you access the next area. Sometimes instead of an item, it will be some kind of code or pattern you need to remember and input in some other area of the environment. Again, if you've played any survival horror game in the style of Silent Hill, this should come naturally to you. You know, easy stuff like putting your combination or sequence into a lock or clock or piano. Okay, yeah, I'll be honest, the piano one took me a few tries. Having to remember not a word but an actual sound to transcribe felt like some proper old school design, but was pretty satisfying to solve as a result. It's the way these simple brain teasers engage you with the world of Detention that makes for its best moments. Navigating different puzzle rooms via a radio playing various period appropriate music tracks is one of the highlights, for example. With just a few abstract backgrounds, the game manages to perfectly put you in the world of a young girl going through distressing family drama in a far-off culture and time super effectively. The way you deal with enemies is pretty simplistic, and they're more akin to little puzzles of their own rather than genuine inhabitants of this world to interact with. There's a trick for each one of them, and none of those solutions amount to anything complex enough to create, say, a gameplay loop out of. And the game kinda realizes this by only having you deal with each enemy a handful of times before dropping them completely. There's a hint that maybe things are gonna get a little more complex when you pick up an item that distracts enemies, but it's barely used, rather than becoming some emergent strategy you can play around with at any point. The philosophy here is once you've avoided a type of enemy a certain way a couple of times, do you really want to do it over and over to justify some kind of gameplay length quota? And the answer is no, not really, but the environments and world design of Detention are so cool, the music so enveloping, the place and time so interesting, that I am kind of disappointed that there aren't some more complex survival horror mechanics in here to justify a longer game I can spend more time in. Some kind of combat or survival gameplay loop that is entertaining by itself. There's nothing to unlock or anything different to see when replaying really outside of the final chapter. It's a 3-hour experience that you're pretty much done with when it's over. And for an £8 game download, that isn't necessarily a letdown. You know, maybe there would have been more horror games like Detention back in the gamey 90s golden age of classic survival horror that lacks mechanical complexity or replay value if there had been a market outside of the costly physical release where you could sell a smaller game like Detention for under a tenner like you can today. I mean, I guess there were a few games like that back then that were bare bones and sold themselves at physical copy prices, but they were not good or received positively. Detention, though, is pretty good, and while paced kinda oddly, what starts as traditional survival horror turning into basically just a puzzle game set in some spooky rooms by the end, it's captivating enough to recommend. This is a perfectly acceptable indie game that works within its means. It's just that it manages to excel in some areas so well, creating such a great thick atmosphere that for a survival horror fan like myself, it made me long for it to be more than just a good story about adult themes and an alien society, but also for it to be a standout gameplay experience. Nevertheless, a great little humble title from these developers who I now have my eye on. The game is available on PC, PS4 and Switch. I played the Switch version, which I found serviceable. Some of the loading times seemed a bit long at points, I'm assuming they would be shorter on PC for example. And it did crash at one point while recording some footage on a second run through, but I completed the game without any game progression breakers or anything, I suppose. It's pretty short and slow paced, it might be an acquired taste for some, but I definitely didn't regret the playthrough or the money I burnt to experience it.